There is research over the past more than 25 years that shows that primary sponsors, as we usually call them, meaning usually executive leaders in important change initiatives, are the most important factor in the success or the failure of change. And so that is reason enough for them to want to pay attention to what it means to lead change and obviously to do it.
Welcome to the Inner Game of Change podcast, where I explore the intricate layers of organizational change alongside insightful professionals in the field. I am your host, Ali Juma, and this is the Inner Game of Change podcast. Today I'm thrilled to welcome the change professional, Paula Anastasiade. Paula is a seasoned organizational change manager with a wealth of experience in ERP implementations, technology deployments, automations, and mergers and acquisitions. Through her extensive expertise, Paula is always invited to offer invaluable advice to senior executives on key change management components, including change strategy, adoption, and communication. In this episode, Paula shares her profound knowledge and insights on organizational change management. We discuss the bedrocks of effective change management: leadership, stakeholder engagement, communication, and organizational change capabilities. I am grateful to have Paula chatting with me today. Well, Paula, thank you so much for joining me in the Inner Game of Change podcast. I am eternally grateful for your time today.
Thank you very much for having me. It's a great pleasure to be with you.
Thank you so much, Paula. You are my guest from Romania. We will talk today about organizational change management as a topic. Hopefully, we're going to unpack it a little bit and give our audience maybe a deeper level and a richer version of what it means, because sometimes those terms got thrown around loosely. But before we start, it will be fantastic if you can introduce yourself to my audience.
Sounds good. I've been in organizational change management for the past 8 years, primarily working on large-scale global transformation and change projects. And I'm currently working as an independent change manager. And in that capacity, I offer 3 types of services to my clients. One is hands-on change management, whether it be at project, program, or portfolio level. The second is consulting/advisory, depending on the needs of the client. And that is primarily targeted to executive and senior leaders who are interested in leading successful transformation and change. And the third one is training. I offer change management training based on the specific roles that specific actors play in change. And here we talk primarily about executive leaders, mid-level managers, and also project managers that need to work with change managers, but maybe don't have a background or any understanding of change management.
What was your role before you started in the field of change management?
I was working in the NGO sector in internal and external communication and program development. I was working with an American NGO that is one of the main actors out there promoting market reform, and basically teaching chambers of commerce and member-based associations to become sustainable and not depend on member dues.
What are some of the skills and capabilities that particular role helps you with your current position?
Well, several things. I would say first and foremost, communication and understanding stakeholders. I was working primarily with executive stakeholders from these associations. And so their perspective helped me understand how executives think about things. I was also heavily involved in co-designing training and leading training. And that also gave me a perspective on stakeholder needs, what they expect from training. So I think if I were to summarize that, it's perspective taking at an executive level.
Yeah, they are complementary capabilities. It's always interesting to talk to the change management professionals, and majority of us come from different backgrounds, and but all of those backgrounds help with our craft. Organizational change management, in a nutshell, can you simplify that to us?
I can, except I need a small disclaimer. This is not necessarily an original explanation. I heard it somewhere,
Sure.
and I think it's really good. So when we prepare for change, that involves developing a solution. And I'm calling it generically a solution because it can be anything. It can be technology, it can be processes, it can be restructuring, anything else. And this solution has to be prepared for the organization. And organizational change management is about preparing the organization for the solution. This is how I would summarize it.
Yeah. Let's talk about the role of leadership in the organizational change management. What's their role in today's world? What your definition talks about it in in an idealistic sense. How can we make that in a practical way? And what's the role of the leadership in ensuring that the organization has a robust organizational change management? Are we talking here about having a framework, or are we talking here about having guiding principles when it comes to change?
I think it's a little bit of both. And when I think about leadership, I think about two levels. First and foremost, executive leaders, who often play the role of change sponsors, a role that they are hardly prepared to play because there is a lack of change management presence in the business education system overall, even within the world's top 100 business schools, as I've come to discover in my recent research. And then the other level that I'm thinking of is the mid-level leadership, middle managers, if you will, who are often neglected, but who have a very important role to play in leading change. If I go back to the first category, executive leaders, and what it means to be a change sponsor, first and foremost, it has to do with understanding what change management is and why it's important. Then leaders need to understand what the roles are, what people are involved in making change happen, and particularly what their role is. There is research over the past more than 25 years that shows that primary sponsors, as we usually call them, meaning usually executive leaders in important change initiatives, are the most important factor in the success or the failure of change. And so that is reason enough for them to want to pay attention to what it means to lead change and obviously to do it. When it comes to the second group I referred to, mid-level managers or frontline managers, how they are usually called, have a very important role in leading their teams through change, but in different ways that we can elaborate on. But the idea is that both the leaders, both the executive leaders as change sponsors and frontline managers are absolutely indispensable to successful changes. And they both need to understand what their specific role is, what it takes to fulfill that role. And obviously, we need education for that.
Let's talk about that education piece. What does it look like? What you just mentioned is great. But the reality is that the majority of organizations, they somehow work in silos. And that poses a huge challenge to driving one overarching organizational change experience, let's just call it that. He did talk about the executive level. I want to touch on the middle management because I think that's a very critical slice in the pie. And they are the enablers. I see them as the people that can make or break a change. So I know that I talked about a couple of things, but let's just talk about what's your view when you see organizations work in silos and one business function deals with change differently from the other, and yet we look at the organization as one unit.
Siloed work is a systemic issue. And for systemic issues, we need systemic solutions. For me, it all starts from the executive leader's ability to grasp the importance of working in a cohesive manner. And in theory, all leaders have that understanding. But in practice, it's a different story. So that is why I think leaders must have an education in change management. They must be exposed to the foundations of change management and integrate those key principles into their practice. Whether or not they realize it, leaders are always in the limelight. And certain primary sponsors don't see the need for that, for their continued exposure to people. In other words, a lot of primary sponsors from the executive ranks think that sponsorship means a generous pocket and an authoritative title that opens doors. And it's much more than that. And until leaders or more leaders at the executive level understand their particular role and the need to become involved and active with a change from the beginning until the end, we will not see siloed work disappear. It's because it's the leaders who set the vision and who set an example and who create the rules of the game. This is my view on siloed work in a nutshell.
When we see leaders, then the feeling we get that we are supported, there's going to be less uncertainty happening in there, and that there's a huge belief from the leadership, and therefore I gotta have to look at this particular change. When you talk about, some people call it educating the leadership group, or they need to be educated. Sometimes, Paula, it doesn't mean that they need to go and join a course. Sometimes it can be as simple as the change manager can sit them for half an hour or an hour and actually explain their role to them. Would you agree with that?
Yes and no. Mm-hmm. I think that half an hour is too little time to walk leaders through everything they need to know. I think that for someone in an executive leadership role who has had no exposure to change management, it's very important to sit down, whether it be in the context of a course or a workshop or a private session, and absorb the foundational information about, for example, what is change management? Why is it important for your organization? Why do you need it and when? What happens if you don't have it? Then talk about the roles. Who does what in change management? And what is your particular role as a leader? How do your other leaders come into play? How do frontline managers come into play? What does the change manager do? What can you expect from them? What does a project manager do? What is the working model for these key roles? How do you build a good strategy to drive change? How do you, first of all, plan or build a vision around change? A lot of important topics, and I doubt that if we just jump to the tactics, we can solve the issue. I'm a strong believer that understanding and education, or understanding through education and experience, but first of all, education, is the key to a lot of the issues we see in organizations of all sizes and in all sorts of industries.
Sometimes it is hard to, what we call, have a seat at the table with the executive team. What are some of the strategies that change managers can look at and consider when it comes to influencing up? Because basically when you engage with a senior leader, that is you engaging with another stakeholder, and that's a stakeholder management. What's your take on that? What has worked for you in the past?
I think this very much depends on where you sit. For example, if you are part of the regular staff, you might need to leverage the help that other senior leaders can provide in order to get a seat at the table. And so you need to work your way up and try to persuade other senior leaders who can persuade other senior leaders up until you reach the level where you need to be. That is, of course, quite challenging, as many of us have seen firsthand. The other scenario is where you are an independent consultant. And in my experience, and it's probably one of the reasons why, not probably, but it is one of the reasons why I decided to work as an independent, certain organizational leaders are more inclined to pay attention and to listen to the advice and the recommendations and the strategies designed and offered by an outside provider. I don't exactly know why that is. I think that a lot of us out there are wondering why things are like that, because many of us have been, myself included, in contexts where our strategies and advice were not necessarily given as much attention when we were part of the regular staff, as opposed to when we were offering our services as external providers. It probably has to do with the awareness of the investment that the company is making. It probably feels like when you invest in external assistance, it's somehow more valuable than the assistance you can get from people who are already on your payroll. I don't know. It's a hypothesis. It's an opinion I have. I don't have any science to back that up.
Well, I can share my thoughts on that, Paula. You know, the investment is one aspect of it, but it's not the first aspect. Because I did it in the past, and I was in a managerial position, and I got a consultant to help me with a problem that I know internal people talk to me about. And I can tell you, when I hire an external person, there's an inherent expectation that you have more market experience and insight that an internal person is not exposed to. That doesn't mean...
And fresh eyes.
Yes. Well, the fresh eyes comes from this detachment. So when I'm detached, then I can see the picture has got a better resolution for me. Okay, so I am not entwined in the policies and the politics and the challenges, internal challenges of an organization. So that these are some of the aspects. That's not saying that internal person will not have the capabilities, because some of them push the boundaries and actually do have great market insight. But these are the exceptions. But the responsibility on the external provider is to deliver that market value. So there's no point of actually not bringing anything new. So the only difference really between an external, in my opinion, and internal is that level of insight, because you would have worked with multiple clients. And so that makes a bit of a difference. And they usually have you within a specific period of time. That is by purpose and by design, because yes. I only need your insight to help me with a problem. And that's why we have an external eye. That detachment is really important. I mean, you call it independent. We call it here consultant or a contractor. I want to share with you something that I think I shared it with one of the guests over the last couple of years. I can't remember which episode, but I've always looked at leadership, and I came up with my own definition for it. And I thought a leader's job is to come to work every day with one purpose. Leaders who may listen to this may disagree, but that's my opinion. You come to work for one purpose. A leader's job is to help their people succeed. That is really the main job of why you have a leader. Now, how do you do that? You look at your work conditions and you make decisions. So every day a leader makes decisions. Those decisions, hopefully the right ones, they turn into changes, because a decision will push for changes. And then, therefore, by default, a leader is actually a change maker. So, for example, we vote for new governments in societies. No government will put a flag to say, vote for me because I'm going to keep the status quo. Governments that would need to be voted for, the governments that are trying to drive change. And so therefore, if you look at a government as a leadership group, that's my opinion anyway. So when we talk to leaders, we say, this is why I want to back your statement around why we need leaders to understand the impact of change on their organization. Because an organization is a dynamic body, and it responds to changes all the time. If the leader will understand that they are actually by default a change maker, then perhaps that's another way to nudge them to say it's in your best interest to understand what this game is about. I want to shift gear and ask you maybe a different question. What would an organization look like if they don't have a clear organizational change management vision or a strategy?
The only word that comes to mind is chaos, to be quite blunt. Unless you have a clear understanding of what you want to become and where you're headed, there is no way you can achieve much. And I think this is very connected to the issue of measuring effectiveness in change management. Because it all has to start with something that I see is often missing, which is a clear understanding of the problem statement. We are not driving change in organizations for the sake of driving change, or at least it shouldn't be that way. We should be driving change either because that helps us solve a problem, or because it helps us improve an existing situation. And so we have to be very clear about why we want to drive change. I think we need to analyze several possibilities for solving that problem. And decision-making academics say, based on their research, that in a lot of organizations, leaders jump to the very first idea that comes to mind as opposed to exploring the various possibilities. And it turns out down the road, after time and considerable investments went into making that happen, that in fact, the solution that got chosen was not the right solution. It did not meet the need. It did not solve the problem. So I think we need to rethink the way we drive change, or actually we initiate it in the first place. And then once we've understood what it is that we are solving for, we need to have an understanding of what our objectives are. What are we moving towards? And so when this vision for change and this understanding of what success looks like are just not there, it's impossible for us to measure how effective the changes were and, of course, how effective change management was.
I've been talking to a group of people in the business of capability, and then I was promoting the idea that if a team's engagement level is very high, I guarantee you that if you look at the way they manage change, it will be a very positive change experience. And in that way, I strongly believe that the way we manage change in an organization will directly impact an employee engagement, because it does impact the employee experience.
Yes.
Are you with
yes,
me
it
on
does.
that?
And I've also seen a connection between how onboarding is structured and how changes get managed. It's perhaps a subtle connection. I don't necessarily have science behind it, aside from my own observations, which obviously do not qualify as science. But I have noticed that organizations that put a lot of thought into their onboarding processes also happen to be organizations that are quite good at managing change, because the essence is the same.
Yes.
You are looking at your stakeholder and really considering their experience from their perspective, not from your own perspective. In other words, you ask yourself what it is they are looking for and how you can best meet that need, and that need for psychological safety, for certainty, for predictability. And then you take steps to meet that need.
How often do we need to measure the change experience within an organization?
It depends on the number of changes we are running, their amplitude, their complexity. I don't think there is or at least I don't have a standard answer for that. But for the average organization these days, where we see a lot of changes happening in parallel, it's very important to measure this at least once a year or even twice a year, because all these changes, whether we realize it or not, do have, like you said, strong impact on how engaged people are. There are certain things that leaders are often unaware of, namely the aggregate impact of the change or of the changes running in the organization at any given point in time. And they lose sight of how all those changes can impact people and obviously their satisfaction, their engagement with the organization. So I would say at least once a year.
I'm going to share with you some observation, and I haven't really, again, like how you described it, I don't have science apart from my own personal observation. We've got one organization where you've got multiple projects happening at the same time. And then sometimes we have multiple change managers managing those projects. Well, they are part of those projects. I often see that it is an unfortunate outcome, but it is the reality that the change experience depends on the capability of the change manager and how much attention they pay to that. Is that your experience as well?
Yes, absolutely. Because it's not just a matter of getting formal qualifications. It's also a matter of experience and business acumen, which you can only develop over time.
I want to go back to the idea of the topic around middle management, because I strongly believe that when we deal with the middle manager, and I do it in my practice, apart from building a good relationship with them, and I literally say to them, I'm going to be camping in your area for a number of months, so we'd better be friends. The idea is that, and I can be very open with them, that I am not an interruption to your operation. I'm going to bring a change, but you will need to lead that change. I'm not leading it for you, but I will be supporting you and help you lead it within your team. Because you would need to be interested in the type of change experience that this change will bring to your team, because that is your team and the way they feel is your responsibility. That's one way of me, and so far nobody said no to me. So I don't know, it may have worked with a lot of them. But I think one of the things that I discovered is that if we have this honest conversation and we back it up by evidence, and then we help them be successful, then we really will be halfway through a very good practice when it comes to the middle management. Because I do see them, some of them will be engaged, and some of them will be saying, yeah, that's fine. And some of them do not even show up to the briefing sessions and all of that. And I always say to them, you're going to have to be there because I can talk about this, but you would need to talk about the change. Is that your experience as well?
It is. I would just add to that there are certain organizations where executive leaders set the expectation that the change manager will actually be the face of the change, leading the change, as opposed to being a backstage presence as we should be. And so in such contexts, if this is the message coming from the executive leaders, then middle managers cannot really be expected to think otherwise or to act otherwise. Of course, some may do it regardless, but the baseline expectation would be for them as well that the change manager will be leading change. Now, in my training program, specifically designed for people managers, for mid-level managers, you are right. I do notice this as well, because many of the managers attending these programs that I host come in with a genuine desire to lead change, to understand what it means to lead change beyond the pep talk and the corporate buzzwords that don't really tell us much. But there are also others who come because their organization wants them to come to this training. And they don't necessarily see the need for them to get involved in managing change, or at least not at the outset. By the end of the program, that perspective typically changes. But in the beginning, you're right, they come in with various levels of understanding and appreciation for their role as leaders of change. The trouble is that in many organizations, one very common sense fact is forgotten, and that is that middle managers are first and foremost employees before being managers. And so they are often treated as if they somehow need to be on board by default, as they somehow need to know by default that the organization is running certain changes. And so there's little focus on them as recipients of the change, not just as drivers of change. And unless we tackle both aspects, we will not get too far.
Yeah. I want to shift gear and I'm aware of time and we are coming close to the end of the podcast. I'm thoroughly enjoying this. You made me think about a couple of things that I really need to consider in my practice. And I want to be more articulate about what is my value as an external person to an organization. So we both talked about that. I've got a feeling that the topic of organizational change management before COVID was important, and now it's probably even more important, considering organizations now face the AI technology coming their way, new ways of working, the hybrid, the technological advancement, the cultural transformation, the diversity and inclusivity. The staff expectations are different now. Am I right in thinking that more than ever that we need to pay attention to this now?
I think so. And I would add to what you mentioned, the topic of digital transformation, which is very much in fashion these days. And actually, business schools around the world have caught on to the importance of digital transformation, except unfortunately, they don't fully understand it. And they just treat digital transformation as something that has to do purely with technology, when in fact, it has a lot to do with people and processes in addition to technology.
Yeah.
We talk a lot about AI, we talk a lot about things like ERP and cloud and machine learning and so on and so forth, without understanding, at least in these academic environments, that you cannot decouple technology from people and processes.
Yeah.
And so I think that in this day and age where a lot of senior leaders attend executive courses, executive education programs, whether it be in business schools or via leadership development programs offered within their companies or outside, they need to understand what's at stake in digital transformation. And yes, all the other things you've mentioned are very important, for example, DEI. But I see a lot of disproportionate interest in adopting AI and other technologies, because that is where leaders really see competitive advantage. But that competitive advantage cannot be obtained unless we pay attention to people and processes and incorporate change management as a robust practice, building our capability from the ground up if needed, in order to face up to that challenge.
Well, technology for me is an enabler to build capability. So that's why I think your point around you can have the best technology, and if it's detached from the human aspect of it, it'll be a useless exercise, and then
Yes.
you create more frustration and all of that. So I think the majority of the businesses out there understand it, they believe in it, but I'm not too sure if the application of it is really solid. If you talk to a leader, they will basically saying to you, yeah, we think it's important. But in reality, how do you make that important as a practice within an organization? That's really what differentiates those people who talk about it and those people who understand it deeply and pay attention to it. In fact,
it's true.
Yeah.
It's true, except there are leaders who do take it seriously. And as a measure of that, they attend, like I said, executive education courses offered by the world's top business schools. Yeah. And they get out of those courses thinking that they know everything there is to know about digital transformation, when in fact they don't. They barely scratch the surface, because in my research, it looks like most of these courses on digital transformation simply deal with the technology. They merely provide an introduction to what types of technology are out there and what senior executives could consider integrating into their own organizations. That's it. That's where it stops.
Yeah.
In some cases, they also talk about a so-called digital strategy. But again, that is very, very superficial, in my opinion.
Will we see a rise of the chief change officer?
There are organizations where this role already exists. Yeah. And I salute that, because it's a recognition of the importance of dealing with change and transformation in an appropriate way. There are other organizations where we also have the Chief Transformation Office as well, and the Chief Transformation Officer. What's important is for change management to have a seat at the table. The designation, in other words, the title of the person taking this message to the executive table, matters less to me than their mandate and their determination.
That is a great way to describe it. I often ask my guests the last question, which is, from where you sit, what would be your advice to people like myself and the change and communication community when it comes to organizational change management?
I don't know that I have any advice for a seasoned practitioner such as yourself, other than maybe a request to keep doing what you're doing with the inner game of change, and now the outer game of change, which would be very valuable, not just for us change practitioners to listen to, but especially for executives out there who feel like there's something missing, like they could use a bit of insight from fellow executives running change and transformation, which is exactly what your podcasts bring. Podcasts, but especially the outer game of change brings.
Thank you. And what would be your advice to the general community in the change practice when it comes to the organizational change management?
Keep learning, I would say. This is what I try to do, and I would always advise other people. And then, of course, if anyone who's just starting out in change management is listening to us today, I would say, aside from getting formal qualifications and getting your hands into all sorts of projects to get practical experience, consider working with a mentor or a coach, because that helps save you years of learning the hard way.
Paula, this is a great way to leave it at that and finish the podcast. It's been a pleasure having you in my podcast, The Inner Game of Change. I hope to get you back at some stage in the future. And perhaps I want to touch and cover the topic of how do you build your capability as a change professional.
I would love that, and thank you again for having me.
Until next time, stay well and stay safe, Paula. Thank you.
You too.
Thanks. Thank you for listening. If you found this episode valuable, remember to subscribe to stay updated on upcoming episodes. Your support is truly appreciated. And by sharing this podcast with your colleagues, friends, and fellow change practitioners, it can help me reach even more individuals and professionals who can benefit from these discussions. Remember, and in my opinion, change is an enduring force, and you will only have a measure of certainty and control when you embrace it. Until next time, thank you for being part of the Inner Game of Change community. I am Ali Juma, and this is the Inner Game of Change podcast.